Ethiopia, Africa's oldest sovereign state, sits in the northeast, in the Horn of Africa, close to the Middle East, above Kenya, and between Somalia and Sudan. Its strategic position, tremendous beauty, and natural resources contrast sharply with its periodic droughts and desperate poverty.
This year, the spring and summer rains failed, leaving parched earth and scrawny cattle. This substantial watering hole was a lifeline for livestock in the village. Now it is bone dry. In fact, the moisture content of the soil in this area is the lowest it's ever been.
This country of contrasts, with a population of nearly 100 million, is distinguished from its neighbours by a proud mixed religious heritage. Historically, Muslim and Christian communities coexisted in relative peace here. In 1991, a military dictatorship that had ruled the nation with an iron fist since the mid-70s was overthrown by a coalition of rebel forces. The victorious groups formed a transitional government led by the Tigray People Liberation Front, or TPLF, under President Meles Zenawi. Following a transitional period, a new constitution was adopted, promising a clean break with the ills of the past. The constitution provided for an extensive catalogue of human and democratic rights, including the freedom of expression, religion, and association. A founding member of the United Nations, Ethiopia has forged strong ties with the West over the last few decades. US President Bill Clinton famously hailed Zenawi as one of a new breed of Renaissance leaders in Africa. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair described him as being among a new generation of African leaders and invited him to join Commission for Africa, a development initiative founded by the British government. But this was a sham. Zenawi's reformist image abroad stood in sharp contrast to his brutal and authoritarian tactics at home.
But those who say that you have two faces, you have the face for Davos, of charming, a progressive, and you have another face, which is totalitarian and repressive. How do you respond to that?
As far as I'm concerned, what you see is what you get. No two faces, there's just one.
The modernizing exterior and friendliness with the West masked the terrible reality of an old-breed authoritarian dictatorship in the mold of Idi Amin of Uganda and Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire.
Ethiopia is one of the most difficult places to work, either as a human rights or even to some extent perhaps as for some humanitarian agencies. It's one of the most difficult places to work on the African continent. There are huge challenges with doing investigation on the ground because the security apparatus of the government is extremely extensive and permeates even the lowest levels, the grassroots, the village levels. You have officials who are informing about if a stranger comes and who they're talking to, and all of that will be reported. So it's very difficult to do surreptitious investigation.
While America and its allies continue to praise Ethiopia's narrative of revival and renaissance, the Ethiopian government continued to manipulate and use the economic improvements of the last quarter century to cement its image as a key partner in the Horn of Africa.
The United States share a long friendship. Our people have worked together, traded with each other, and stood alongside one another for more than 100 years.
For example, the Ethiopian government's attempt to domesticate and use the global war on terror for its own internal politics mean that Ethiopia's Muslim communities are blamed and labeled as extremists and subjected to harassment, jail, and intimidation by security forces.
One of the lesser-known consequences of the U.S.-led so-called war on terror has been a wave of anti-terrorism legislation in other countries. One of them is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has never been known for freedom of the press. And with the disputed general election back in 2005, ongoing internal conflicts with separatist groups, and the powers that be keeping a wary eye on the nearby Arab Spring, the government in Addis Ababa has been cracking down on the media.
All this so that Ethiopia can prove to its powerful Western allies and sponsors that they too are fighting the same war in defense of freedom and liberty.
In a recent report, Human Rights Watch said, quote, authorities use arbitrary arrests and politically motivated prosecutions to silence journalists, bloggers, protesters, and perceived supporters of opposition political parties.
Domestic media is completely muzzled, and foreign media is rarely allowed into the country.
Riot Olemu was jailed in 2011 under the country's anti-terrorism law and charged with planning and conspiring a terrorist act, possessing property for terrorist acts, and participating in the promotion or communication of a terrorist act. She was sentenced to 14 years in Ethiopia's infamous Kaliti prison.
Whenever foreign journalists are allowed, they are expected to apply the utmost caution not to embarrass the government or face harsh repercussions.
We're under gunpoint or forced to say things on tape. They bring in 2 civilians, dress them as rebels, and put them in the same frame as us, give them guns. At one point, I get to talk to the president of the Somali regional state, and he tells me on a satellite telephone that he's not satisfied with our performances during today's filming. So tomorrow we will have to do it all over again.
Yeah. I have a sit properly.
The next day they kind of hire the stakes, and Abdullah Verar, the vice president, he arranges a mock execution where I am forced to walk towards a desert horizon, and behind me I have 45 Ethiopian army soldiers who secures their guns, and they say, now you have to tell the truth or we will shoot you. You will die here in the desert and we will blame the rebels. And then they fire in the bush next to me. And from the shot I fall down on the ground and realize that I'm still alive. And then a film camera comes up and another interrogation takes place.
The reason we came...
The so-called confessions filmed in the desert were aired on state-run television, but that was only the beginning of their legal woes.
Their entire proceedings really were wrought with fair trial violations.
For now, the Ethiopian government is using its anti-terrorism law as a tool against dissent, and journalists are either collateral damage in the so-called war on terror, or the government considers them the real enemy.
According to a recent report by Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 60 journalists have been forced into exile since 2010 alone, and at least 19 have been jailed. In 2014 alone, 30 journalists were forced to leave the country. 22 journalists were charged with crimes. 5 magazines and 1 newspaper were closed. Since 2009, over 40 journalists were arrested and tried under the Anti-Terrorism Proclamation.
So the arrest happened on April 25th. 6 9 bloggers who are my friends, and the other 3 journalists who are close friends to the bloggers had been arrested on April 25th. Then we waited for 86 days, and after that the charges came. The first one was terrorism, and the other one was outrage against the constitution, trying to change the government unconstitutionally. Those were the charges. And for the last 6 months, we're still talking about the clear charges, but basically it is terrorism and treason.
Ethiopia has the shameful distinction of being the second worst jailer of journalists in Africa after Eritrea, and of having the second most journalists in exile in the world after Iran. It is a surveillance state in which freedom of expression and association are seen as serious threats. The Ethiopian government is draconian in its methods, rigging elections, muzzling the press, jailing activists, and brutally suppressing its adversaries. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, a coalition of 4 ethnic-based parties dominated by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, now runs the country with extremely questionable mandate. In 2015, the coalition won a ludicrous 100% of seats in parliament by wiping out the 1 opposition seat gained in the previous election.
Mr. Chairman, Ethiopia is not democratizing. The May 2010 elections provided a stark illustration of this fact. As you know, the ruling party won more than 99% of the vote. But what concerns Human Rights Watch more even than the results of these elections is the fact that they are simply a milestone in a broader agenda and strategy of consolidating control.
The ruling party held on to power for 25 years by constantly playing off one ethnic or religious group against the other to create crises that justify extreme repression and totalitarian tactics.
Human Rights Watch's research on the ground indicates that the government has used a multi-pronged strategy of repression. And as I said, this was partly in the lead up to the elections, but it's a strategy that we fear will continue long after the elections. And one of the elements in this strategy has been the repression of the political opposition. I think you're all aware that government critics have been subjected to arbitrary detention, to harassment, and sometimes even torture in detention.
A series of government massacres, the deployment of Western humanitarian aid to buy weapons, and ongoing human rights abuses to rival any notorious regime in the world, from North Korea to Saddam's Iraq or Gaddafi's Libya, have occurred with increasing frequency since the EPRDF took power in 1991.
We were using aid money to buy arms, through secondary means, So we were using some of the money to buy arms.
In the years that followed, human rights groups tried to raise the alarm without success. Then came 9/11.
What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing? Holy fuck!
On September the 11th, enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
As world events took a sharp turn for the worse, the Ethiopian government positioned itself as a reliable ally and a local partner in the deepening global war on terror. The West saw Ethiopia as a strategic observation post and a regional police force that should be supported to provide the security and stability needed in the Horn of Africa.
Somalia's Islamic court says it's now at war with Ethiopia. The courts have accused Ethiopia of shelling positions in courts-held territory. This comes a day after an EU envoy brokered a commitment for new peace talks between the courts and the Somali interim government.
In 2006, Ethiopia sent troops into Somalia and justified its intervention as an act of self-defense against a terrorist group.
I believe they represent a direct threat, first to Somalia and the Somali people, secondly to the region and Ethiopia, and lastly to the international community.
The US and Europeans poured in much-needed cash, which was then used to build the political machine used for domestic surveillance. According to human rights groups such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and counter-terrorism experts, Somalia is possibly the clearest example of the failure of US and Ethiopian counter-terrorism policy, which actually has produced what it was supposed to counter. Al-Shabaab grew in strength only after the 2006 Ethiopian invasion, was never an affiliate of Al-Qaeda until 2012.
Al-Shabaab was a small network of about 30 individuals. And immediately before the invasion, it was a small component of the Islamic Courts Union, and its appeal was ideological rather than practical. After the Ethiopian invasion, basically the Ethiopian invasion and subsequent atrocities against civilian populations gave Al-Shabaab what it never had, local grievances. And on that local grievance, Al-Shabaab built a narrative of resistance, which eventually made it the largest jihadi organization in the world.
In 2011, the EPRDF directly targeted the Muslim community at home, in direct violation of the Constitution and international human rights norms. In July of that year, during a religious meeting at Haramaya University, the government introduced an indoctrination campaign. This would effectively force the country's Muslim population to adopt the teachings of a Lebanese Muslim sect known as Ahbash.
I was invited by Dr. Shafava. I took some time to check the situation in Ethiopia before meeting with you. I believe the Ethiopian government, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, Dr. Shafava, the Minister of Federal Affairs, and other ministers understand the issues very well, and they are taking the proper and wise steps. I thank all of them.
The ruling party sponsored Ahbash leaders to spread the teachings of their sect. Ahbash trainers coordinated their efforts with government leaders and the civil service to carry out their mission. This west-facing strategy demonstrates that Ethiopia was dealing with the same problem of extremism as its Western allies.
Ethiopia faces serious threats, and its contribution to the African Union mission in Somalia have reduced areas under al-Shabaab control. But as the Prime Minister noted, yesterday's bombing in Mogadishu reminds us that terrorist groups like al-Shabaab offer nothing but death and destruction and have to be stopped. We've got more work to do. This past week, Ethiopian troops have helped retake 2 major al-Shabaab strongholds. We have to now keep the pressure on.
Yet Orthodox Muslims saw the imposition of a new creed as an insult and an affront to their constitutional rights, a chilling reminder of a time in Ethiopian history where Muslims were treated as second-class citizens. Nonetheless, a series of sweeping reforms were instituted. First, Ahbash leaders replaced others on the Ethiopian Islamic Affairs Council, often referred to as the Majlis. Next, compulsory Ahbash religious training programs were set up in mosques around the country. Anyone who objected to this would be harassed, arrested, or charged with trumped-up charges. Mosques, Islamic schools, colleges and institutions were ordered to implement Ahbash doctrine. Protests began immediately. In December 2011, the movement was born when the government gave complete control of Awaliya College, the only Islamic institution in the country in which Muslims comprise well over a third of the population, to Majlis. At the campus mosque, the imam was dismissed, along with 50 teachers and 36 students. The students reached out to the community for help. Huge crowds appeared at the campus to support the students. Over 60,000 people came to march in solidarity. They voted to form a committee of leaders to take their collective demands to government for a legal and peaceful discussion. 3 demands were agreed. First and foremost, the Ethiopian Islamic Affairs Council should be replaced in free and democratic elections among the Muslim community. The program of forcible indoctrination of Orthodox Muslims had to be stopped. The college, the seat of Islamic education in the nation's capital, had to be independent again. A petition calling for these 3 vital concessions was signed by over 1 million Muslims at home and abroad. The response was swift. On March 5, 2012, the leaders of the movement were accused of being terrorists by the very government that initially negotiated with them. Charged with conspiring to establish an Islamic State in Ethiopia, perhaps the most explosive crimes imaginable, the leaders were subjected to politically motivated show trials that would have made Stalin proud.
The trial is a moment in which we, as members of political community, apply to ourselves the norms that we have given ourselves. It is supposed to be a forum for accountability and justice, a moment for a reasoned and rational deliberation over the guilt and the innocence of the accused, where an independent and competent court of law weighs the charge against the accused, renders judgment and meets out. due punishment. And this has to be done under conditions of equality of arms between the state and the accused. And the accused in this case has to be provided with the opportunity to mount a vigorous defense, demonstrating his or her innocence. But what happened in the course of these proceedings actually has nothing to do whatsoever with questions of accountability and justice. And indeed, the very ideology that inspired these trials, the very thought that animated these trials, are very much hostile to the ideals of justice and the rule of law. The courts which presided over this trial are very much part of a regime that has not only abandoned justice as a policy, but went beyond and instrumentalized institutions of truth and justice to legitimize and rationalize and justify oppressive politics.
The movement continued to demand a positive answer to its lawful and constitutional demands. In a small triumph for democracy, the Ethiopian government itself recognized these demands as legitimate and began negotiations with the committee. Sadly, before long it abandoned talks and reverted to the same tactics of violence and naked force. In July 2012, government troops came to Awalia, desecrated the mosque, and branded all protesters as violent terrorists. The movement's answer was again to make a declaration of non-violence that they have held to ever since, saying, "We don't commit terrorism because Islam forbids it." Leaders and members of the movement, Muslim scholars and journalists were hunted down, arrested, detained and tortured. Women, children and the elderly were caught up in July's brutal crackdown as they participated in Friday prayers. As the government used its media to smear the protests and label them as terrorists and potential risks to the Ethiopian states, the Muslim community continued to stage peaceful, creative and unprecedented nationwide rallies. Around the country, young people wave placards and yellow flags, a warning sign to the regime that they will never relent. They chant, "They are still our legal representatives. Our words are our covenants." To protest against the violence done to the Constitution and the government's rhetoric of an imminent threat to the unity of the nation, they chanted, "The law is broken. A false charge will not intimidate us. Islam is peace, and the question must be answered." The movement swelled, and the message began to spread beyond the claustrophobic confines of the nation's censored media to reach the global community. And a fourth demand was added to the list. The committee must be released. With the active support of the Muslim diaspora in the West, human rights groups in the US and Europe began to send observers and offer support. The UN also became involved. In 2015, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights instructed the government to investigate allegations of torture and breach of fair trial rights. But nothing changed.
The African Commission ordered Ethiopia to do three simple things. First, it ordered it to investigate the alleged torture of the Muslim civil rights leaders. The second thing it ordered Ethiopia to do was to stop interfering with client-attorney confidentiality. At the time the order was given, the Commission found out that Ethiopia was prohibiting the lawyers, the domestic criminal lawyers of the Muslim civil rights leaders from giving and taking documents and talking to their clients in privacy. That is in violation of human rights, and that would constitute or impose an irreparable harm to the defense of the Muslim civil rights leaders. That was the second order. The third order was Ethiopia should stop releasing videos that violated the presumption of innocence of the Muslim civil rights leaders. These were three very clear orders. And how many of these did Ethiopia implement? None.
In July 2015, while widespread repression in the country continued, President Obama became the first sitting US president ever to visit Ethiopia. He met with Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn, Meles Zenawi's former deputy and a mentee who had vowed to pursue the policies of his predecessor.
There is still a perception, sir, that human rights abuses are tolerated here, and that could really be affecting international investment in your economy. Are you concerned about that? If so, how concerned, and what might you be doing, sir, to change that perception? Thank you.
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, this was a significant topic of conversation. We are very mindful of Ethiopia's history, the hardships that this country's gone through. It has been relatively recently in which the Constitution that was formed and the elections put forward a democratically elected government.
Though Obama included criticism of the government's human rights record in his discussions, he was there to promote strategic ties with America's friend in the fight against terrorism. A month later, the show trial of the movement's leaders, a bizarre exercise in ritualistic legitimation in which the rule of law and procedural guarantees were disregarded, concluded. It had taken nearly 2 years. More than 200 witnesses had spoken for the defense. In a travesty of justice, the resistance leaders were all condemned to long prison sentences. The movement was criminalized, and the despotic government simply ignored outside condemnation from international human rights bodies, the US government, and intergovernmental organizations.
The courts that examined the case of Abubakar Mohammed and 28 others were courts that have proven themselves over and over again to be instruments at the service of repressive politics, instruments used by the ruling elites in the country as devices of terror and propaganda. So why have these trials? Why waste all this time? Why waste all these resources orchestrating spectacles of illegality? Well, that would allow the state basically to say that these individuals were given their day in court. They were really not persecuted. Then everyone would be happy and go home congratulating themselves. But in fact, what is on trial in these courtrooms is not really members of the committee. It's not a human person with a body, with a blood and flesh. It's an idea that is on trial. It is the aspiration of the Muslim community, the community that these individuals represent, that is on trial. It is the idea that the Muslim community in Ethiopia should not be forced to accept a state-sponsored religion that was on trial. It's the idea that Muslims must be able to run their own institution without government minders, which were on trial.
Despite all that has been done by the government, the cause remains alive, and the desire and determination for change is stronger. More than ever before, there is now an entire generation of young people with the courage, conviction, and dedication to produce systemic change. It is a struggle for fairness, dignity, and inclusion, a shared value of civilized society and the same ideals that inspired transformative movements the world over. But there are structural difficulties that remain. A brutal government that has no qualms to sacrifice a portion of its society to stay in power, and an international community that is largely unaware of the injustices taking place every day within Ethiopia. How many more people must be tortured and imprisoned in Ethiopia before the world listens? How much longer can this authoritarian government operate its culture of fear? And how much longer can Western governments enable this architecture of repression simply by turning a blind eye? Sustained non-violent dissent has shown its power again and again around the globe.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
The difference with the Ethiopian Muslims' campaign for human rights is that it is not political or territorial. They are simply asking for religious freedom and inalienable human rights for all, those we consider to be the bedrock of a peaceful, civilized and progressive society. The movement will not give up. Our voice shall be heard. The movement will not be silenced.